Sometimes you just look at a game and think, how did this get released? Why did the publishers releasing this game think it was good to launch? How did it get past quality assurance? These are the games that, especially in retrospect, we can't help but think were pretty much destined to fail, either critically or commercially, or both. This is a feature about 15 such games. Ride to Hell Retribution. Ride to Hell Retribution has received no small amount of criticism, to put it mildly, and yet it still doesn't feel like enough. Some games are simply offensively bad, and this is one such game. From crappy writing to repetitive gameplay, from terrible AI to a litany of bugs, ugly visuals to awkward controls. Ride to Hell Retribution was a game that had critical problems in almost every single area. Big Rigs Over-the-Road Racing. Worst games of all time lists usually have a few common denominators regardless of where you might see them. Big Rigs Over-the-Road Racing is one of them. It's a game that's so laughably broken it's hard to even call it a game, because a game should be at least playable, right? In Big Rigs Over-the-Road Racing, you have to contend with absolutely terrible driving to drive through a whole lot of nothing as your vehicle floats through the geometry of terrible-looking levels. Is it a game? Well, technically yeah, but is it a game really? No. Sonic the Hedgehog 2006. Sonic the Hedgehog might be one of the most legendary platforming franchises in the industry, but Sega's iconic mascot has definitely seen its fair share of ups and downs. The 2006 reboot titled simply Sonic the Hedgehog is probably amongst the series' lowest points. The few core things a good platformer needs to have, good controls and well-designed levels, were all missing, while terrible camera controls and a bafflingly terrible plot drove the game even further into the grave that it had dug for itself. Sonic Boom: Rise of Lyric. Though not a high-profile mainline sequel like the 2006 reboot, Sonic Boom: Rise of Lyric is still another major low point for the series, probably the lowest. At launch, it was criticized for everything, from its controls and camera, yes, again, to its boring combat and terrible story, yes, also again. To date, it remains the lowest-rated Sonic game of all time with a Metacritic score of 32. SimCity 2013. The list of franchises that EA has mismanaged and driven into the ground is long and heartbreaking, and SimCity is probably one of the biggest names in there. EA's misguided attempts at cramming forced multiplayer were not well received by anyone. The game itself was horribly buggy and broken, and in spite of being an online-centric game, it kept getting hit with server outages. It single-handedly killed the SimCity franchise, a fact for which it will never be forgiven. Anthem. Anthem had some cool ideas on paper, but a messy and poorly managed development cycle resulted in a string of bad decisions behind the scenes. After having no clear vision of what they wanted the game to be, BioWare rushed Anthem out the door and was painfully clear to see. It was a loot game that had terrible loot, a BioWare game with poor storytelling, not to mention all of the other issues it had like long loading times, repetitive missions, a lack of content, and its absolutely abysmal post-launch support. Aliens Colonial Marines. Gearbox Software promised the world with Aliens Colonial Marines, but as we all know very well by now, it was little more than a bunch of hot air. The actual game was not even close to what was promised. It was, to put it bluntly, a complete mess. A confused and inconsistent narrative, along with terrible visuals, were huge flaws. But the biggest flaw of them all was the laughably bad AI, which turned combat into a dull affair and the terrifying xenomorphs into mindless monsters running straight into your gunfire. Funnily enough, it was largely because of a typo in the game's code, and that tells you something about how royally Gearbox screwed up with this game. Duke Nukem Forever. Aliens Colonial Marines isn't the only Gearbox game on this list. There's also the infamous Duke Nukem Forever. After having been in development hell for over a decade, it was taken over and finished by Gearbox, so they aren't the only ones to blame. When the game launched, it most certainly did not justify the long wait. Bad humor, dated design, technical issues, clumsy shooting were just a few of the many flaws that dragged this game into the ground. Ghost Recon Breakpoint. A hodgepodge of all of the ideas that Ubisoft games have become notorious for in recent years. Ghost Recon Breakpoint is not at all the follow-up to Wildlands that we all wanted. from its bloated open world to its boring missions, from its bland visuals to its technical issues, from its needless loot mechanics to its half-baked survival mechanics. At every turn, Breakpoint makes one bad decision after another. And let's not forget the microtransactions. Ash's Cricket 2013. Cricket isn't the most well-represented sport in the video game industry, and Ash's Cricket 2013 is probably its worst representation. Even before it launched, the game looked rough, and after launch, it was universally panned for being pretty much unplayable, with many even calling it one of the worst games ever made. Its failure was so absolute, in fact, that the game was taken off sale on Steam just 4 days after launch, while a couple of days after that, publishers 505 Games put it out of its misery and stopped all production of the game. Metal Gear Survive. Not satisfied with having rushed the Phantom Pain out the door and having handled their split with Hideo Kojima in the poorest way possible, Konami decided to drive one more nail into Metal Gear's coffin by releasing Metal Gear Survive. So, what was wrong with it? Well, a great deal. Its dull gameplay, its asinine story, its excessive monetization, well, you name it. It brought shame to the Metal Gear name, and it still does. Fallout 76. Speaking of bringing shame to the name of big franchises, Bethesda's approach to Fallout had definitely been at least somewhat divisive ever since Fallout 3. But with Fallout 76, though, they brought everyone onto the same page because everyone agreed that it was an absolutely terrible game. No NPCs, no bespoke stories, no interesting quests, no VATs, at least not in the way that we like them, terrible visuals, and bucket loads of bugs and glitches. Bethesda's poor marketing and string of PR disasters anytime they did anything related to Fallout 76 only served as icing on the cake. Crackdown 3. Crackdown 3 faced multiple delays, and Microsoft promised some big things with the open-world game. From their statements about wanting to see the franchise in the same category as Gears and Halo, to all their talk of cloud-powered destruction. The Crackdown 3 that launched wasn't the most terrible thing ever, but it was still a massive disappointment. It was bland, forgettable, aged, and dull, and did not justify its multiple delays at all. Superman 64. This is how not to make a Superman game, or a superhero game, or, well, really just a game. Superman 64's failures have become so well documented over the years, from its terrible visuals to its mind-numbingly boring gameplay to so much more. By this point, it's pretty much common wisdom that this right here is one of the worst games ever made, and one look at it is enough to tell you why. E.T. It makes sense to end this feature with E.T., a game that very nearly crashed the games industry, a game that was broken beyond belief, a game that may very well be the worst game ever made. Almost every aspect of the game was widely panned, and the impact it had on not just Atari but the industry as a whole is well known to all by now. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from Gaming Bolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.